What, if any, circumstances would you be willing, in what circumstances, if any, would you be willing to use eminent domain to seize private property?
Eminent domain is always a difficult subject for a city council, for myself, or for the property owner involved, and even the community to deal with. The reality is that sometimes city government in its ability to deliver services needs space that may be currently taken, and as we have a duty to govern, to deliver those services as effectively as possible with as little cost as possible, eminent domain is a tool that from time to time does have to be used. The Constitution of our United States, in fact, deals with the issue and specifically lays out that that governments have the power to use eminent domain in order to further the public interest. In a handful of occasions, we've had to use eminent domain. It was a very difficult process, and if it relates to public works and it relates to whether it's transportation, whether it's infrastructure related, whether it's a delivery of services like water and sewer, and it is by far the lowest cost and by far the best solution, I would be willing and have, in fact, voted to use eminent domain. As it relates to development and other opportunities, the state of Iowa dealt with a lot of those issues in a new law which specifically states that we only want to allow development to happen by eminent domain in areas of the city that are clearly underperforming, are ridden with slum and blight, and if such a situation were to arise in City Council, I'd have to weigh it carefully. It would not be my first choice, but we're up here to govern, we're up here to make tough decisions, and I cannot say with all certainty that I can categorically deny that I would never use it.
Thank you. Mr. Rochester.
Eminent domain is terrible legislation, and it's unfortunate that we even have it to discuss. I think it infringes on individual rights. It's something that I would never vote for. I think if somebody owns property and they don't want to sell it, I think come up with a new plan. I personally hate eminent domain, and again, wish it was not even a topic of discussion. And thank you.
Mr. Hobart.
Eminent domain is a tool that is often used by municipal governments, state governments, and federal governments, but should only be used in cases where it's actually a government purpose. In other words, it's my feeling that eminent domain should not be used to develop private property or for property for private enterprise. It should for parks, for highways, for public works, for projects that are clearly in the public interest, the public purpose, then eminent domain is certainly a viable tool. I think in the case of blight and slums, as Mr. Geary talks about, I'll give you an example where eminent domain was probably used to bully some individuals to sell their property down around the Tyson Event Center. There was a finding by the City Council that the Palmer Building, that all of these buildings that if they were in historic 4th Street would be, they'd be trying to refurbish, were blighted and were a slum area. And we all know that that wasn't a blight and was not a slum area. Those are old buildings, but they were not blighted and they were not slums. So those types of findings, I believe, are abused. And this, as was stated here, the United States Constitution protects the individual landowner from such abuses. And I believe that the City Council should proceed cautiously to use eminent domain.
Okay.
Well, first I'll correct my fine opponent for 2 errors in fact. One, that eminent domain is a tool often used by municipal governments. In fact, in my 2 years on City Council, we've had a discussion about eminent domain exactly once, which I'll explain shortly. Secondly, that the Palmer Candy Company was somehow associated with an issue of domain, which it in fact was not. It was a voluntary agreement and contractual economic development arrangement between the City of Sioux City and Palmer Candy Company. Eminent domain is a much more cumbersome, complicated, and a process which would largely serve to avoid. As Mr. Hobart should know, as a lawyer, eminent domain is largely something you want to stay away from. I do disagree with his opinion, for instance, that we should consider eminent domain for a park. In my opinion, we should only consider eminent domain for a greater public works district's need. And that goes to the example of the one time on council that we confronted this issue. A gentleman owned a piece of property that did not include a private residence, which I also would be loath to enter that issue, but a small portion of his property for the purposes of a water tower, and only reluctantly agreed to enter the eminent domain process after going back to the table time and time and time again, and offering him even substantially more than what that property was worth. That would be a rare situation in which I might support the use of eminent domain by a local government.